Some stories grip the heart from the very first moment, leaving an imprint that lingers long after they're told. This is one of those stories, a tale of survival, resilience, and an extraordinary transformation. Imagine driving down a quiet rural road, the kind where the silence feels heavy, broken only by the occasional rustling of dry grass. Then, out of the corner of your eye, something catches your attention, a frail, motionless figure barely distinguishable from the barren land. At first, it looks like just another forgotten piece of the landscape, but as you get closer, realization strikes like a punch to the gut. It's not just a shape in the distance. It's a living being, barely holding on. This is how it all began. An abandoned donkey, emaciated beyond belief, stood on the brink of death, left to fade into nothingness. His ribs protruded beneath a coat of filth and neglect. His eyes, sunken and hollow, carried the weight of suffering. Every movement was labored, as if even the simple act of breathing required an unbearable effort. But this was not how his story would end. What followed was an incredible journey, one that would take this forgotten soul from the depth of despair to a life filled with love, care, and second chances. Through the dedication of kind-hearted rescuers, the donkey's transformation would become nothing short of miraculous. His story is proof that hope exists even in the darkest moments. And now, as we take you through every moment of his journey, from the day he was found to the day he became unrecognizable, prepare to witness the true power of compassion. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to look away. It was supposed to be just another routine drive, a quiet journey through the countryside where time seemed to move slower. But for the person who stumbled upon him, that moment would be anything but ordinary. It would be a sight they'd never forget, a sight that demanded action. The donkey stood alone in a vast, lifeless field, a place that had long since been abandoned by both man and nature. The ground beneath him was dry and cracked, littered with scattered debris, as if time itself had given up on this place. And perhaps so had he. His body was more bone than muscle, his skin stretched tight over an emaciated frame. Every rib was visible, every joint sharp and pronounced, as though he had been carved out of suffering itself. His fur was matted, caked with dirt, and his hooves were cracked and overgrown, a testament to months, maybe even years of neglect. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Dull, empty, absent of the curiosity and gentle spirit donkeys are known for. There was no fight left in him, no spark of recognition or hope, just a deep, hollow gaze that seemed to ask a single, heartbreaking question. Will this finally be the end? Who could have left him like this? Who could have walked away, knowing he would waste away in this forgotten place? The answers would likely never come, but one thing was certain. If he wasn't rescued soon, there wouldn't be much time left to ask them. The rescuer hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, heart pounding with the weight of responsibility. But as they neared, the donkey flinched, his frail body tensing as if expecting another blow, another moment of cruelty. He didn't know yet that help had finally arrived. There was no telling how long he had been out there, surviving on nothing but scraps and instinct. His body was weak, barely able to support his own weight. If he collapsed now, would he have the strength to stand again? The rescuer knew that every second counted. With careful movements, they approached, speaking softly, offering reassurance in a voice the donkey likely hadn't heard in a long time. If ever, a gentle presence, a promise of safety. But promises meant nothing to an animal who had been abandoned before. The donkey's legs trembled beneath him, exhaustion fighting against fear. He took a shaky step back, his breathing shallow and rapid. Would he even have the strength to walk to safety? The thought was unbearable. Pulling out their phone, the rescuer quickly called for help. There was no way they could do this alone. Minutes felt like hours as they waited, watching this fragile soul standing in the middle of nowhere, swaying ever so slightly as though a single gust of wind might knock him over. Then, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. Help had arrived. The real fight was about to begin. The rescue team moved quickly, their faces set with urgency as they stepped out of the vehicle. They had seen cases like this before. Animals on the brink, clinging to life by sheer will. But it never got easier. And looking at this donkey, it was clear that time was not on his side. One of the rescuers knelt down, speaking in hushed tones, hoping to calm the fragile creature. But fear had become his only instinct. As they reached out, the donkey flinched, his body tensing as if expecting pain. He didn't know that these hands were different, that, for the first time in a long while, no harm would come to him. Moving slowly, they placed a rope halter around his head, their gentle hands guiding rather than forcing. But when they tried to lead him toward the waiting trailer, his legs barely responded. His hooves scraped against the dry earth, his weakened muscles struggling to obey. He swayed, exhaustion threatening to take him down. One of the rescuers shook their head, voice heavy with concern. "He's too weak to walk far. We'll have to lift him." It was a delicate operation. Any sudden movement could send him into panic, and panic could push his body past its limit. They gathered around, carefully distributing his weight, each movement slow and deliberate. The moment they began lifting, the donkey let out a sharp breath, more of a whimper than a protest. He was so light, far too light. With immense care, they placed him onto a padded section of the trailer. One of the team members stayed close, kneeling beside him, running a reassuring hand along his neck as the vehicle began its slow journey toward the rescue center. Inside the trailer, the donkey barely moved. His breathing was shallow, his body limp. It was impossible to know if he understood that help had finally come. But for the first time in what was likely months, maybe even years, he wasn't alone. The road stretched ahead, winding through open fields and quiet landscapes. Every bump in the road made the rescuers glance back, their eyes filled with worry. Would he make it? Would they get there in time? No one spoke the fear aloud, but it hung in the air like a shadow. The rescue center was still miles away. The donkey's fight for survival was far from over. But at least now, for the first time in a long time, he had a chance. As the rescue truck pulled into the sanctuary, a team of veterinarians and caretakers was already waiting. They had been briefed on the emergency. A donkey, critically emaciated, in desperate need of immediate care. No one knew exactly how much time he had left, but they weren't about to waste a second. The trailer door opened, and the sight of him made some of the staff inhale sharply. They had prepared themselves for the worst. But even so, seeing him up close was a gut-wrenching experience. His body looked as if it had been starved for months. His fur, patchy and dull, barely covered the sharp contours of his ribs. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion, barely registered the movement around him. They moved fast but carefully. A stretcher was brought out. He was too weak to walk on his own. As they lifted him onto it, he let out a soft, defeated sound, a noise that seemed less like pain and more like surrender. Inside the examination room, the vet sprang into action. 4 fluids were set up immediately, delivering much-needed hydration and electrolytes into his fragile system. His breathing was shallow but steady. His heart, though slow, was still fighting. One of the veterinarians, Dr. Evans, ran a gentle hand along his bony frame, shaking her head. He's been neglected for a long time. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, possible organ stress, and these hooves. She lifted one of his front legs, revealing overgrown, cracked hooves that hadn't been trimmed in months, maybe even years. We'll need to address that once he's stronger. Blood work was drawn, revealing dangerously low glucose levels and signs of internal inflammation. His stomach was in such a delicate state that even reintroducing food had to be done carefully. Too much too soon could send his body into shock. He's going to need round-the-clock care, one of the caretakers murmured, adjusting the 4 line. But he's still here. That's what matters. There was no guarantee of survival. His body had endured so much, and the road ahead would be long. But now, for the first time in a long time, he was in a place where healing was possible. As the team finished stabilizing him, the donkey's head shifted ever so slightly. He was too weak to lift it, too weak to respond. But for the first time since his rescue, his eyes fluttered open just a little wider, scanning the space around him. He didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed forever. The first night was critical. The veterinary team kept a constant watch over him, monitoring his vitals and adjusting his care as needed. A soft bed of hay cushioned his frail body, offering comfort he likely hadn't felt in years. His 4 dripped steadily, delivering hydration and nutrients in a controlled flow. His body was too weak to handle solid food. So a special refeeding plan was devised, a slow and steady process to help his system adjust without overwhelming it. Every few hours, a caretaker would gently wet his lips with a damp sponge, encouraging him to take in water. At first, he barely responded, too exhausted to care. But by the second night, something changed. He swallowed. It was a tiny action, almost imperceptible, but it sent a ripple of hope through the team. If he could drink, he could fight. His first real meal came in the form of mushy, nutrient-rich gruel. It was a careful balance. Too much, and his body could reject it. Too little, and he wouldn't regain strength. A caretaker knelt beside him, holding a shallow dish under his nose. At first, he didn't react. His eyes remained distant, his breath slow. But then, after what felt like an eternity, his nostrils flared. The scent of food registered. And then he licked, just a small, hesitant movement of his tongue against the soft mash. The caretaker held her breath. "Come on. Boy, you can do this." Another lick, then another, and finally, after a long pause, the donkey took his first feeble mouthful of food. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The entire team exhaled in relief. It was a moment of quiet victory, a sign that deep inside, despite everything, he still wanted to live. The days that followed were slow but steady. He remained under close watch, his intake carefully measured, his hydration levels monitored. Small improvements began to show. His breathing became less labored, his eyes a fraction more alert. But there were setbacks too. One morning, a caretaker found him trembling, his frail body struggling against an unseen enemy. His temperature had dropped dangerously low, a side effect of severe malnutrition. Blankets were quickly draped over him, warm compresses applied to his legs. A heater was brought into the stall. The team worked tirelessly, their hands moving swiftly, their voices calm and reassuring. "Stay with us," one whispered, rubbing gentle circles along his neck. "We're not giving up on you." And he didn't give up. By the next morning, his temperature had stabilized. Another battle won. As the days turned to weeks, his progress became more visible. His coat, once dull and patchy, began to show the faintest signs of new growth. His ribs, though still prominent, were less defined as his body absorbed the nutrients he had been so cruelly deprived of. And most importantly, his eyes, the hollowness that had once consumed them, was slowly being replaced. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was something close, a quiet curiosity, a willingness to keep going. The road to recovery was long, but he had already taken the first steps. And for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. Recovery wasn't just about his body. It was about his spirit. The physical signs of improvement were there. His coat had a slight sheen, his frame was slowly filling out, and he no longer trembled with weakness when he stood. But there was something deeper that still needed healing. He didn't trust humans, and who could blame him? Every interaction before his rescue had likely been one of neglect, indifference, or even cruelty. So when caretakers approached, he remained still, eyes wary, muscles tense as if preparing for the worst. The team knew they couldn't force trust. It had to be earned, one moment at a time. His primary caretaker, Emma, made her mission to help him feel safe. She never rushed him, never demanded more than he could give. Every day, she sat outside his stall, just existing in his space, letting him decide when he was ready to acknowledge her presence. She would read aloud softly, sometimes stories, sometimes just about her day. It didn't matter what she said. It was the calmness of her voice that mattered. At first, he ignored her completely. His gaze remained distant, focused on nothing. But then one day, he flicked an ear toward her. A small movement, barely noticeable, but it was the first sign that he was listening. Encouraged, Emma introduced something new, a treat. Not just any treat, but a small slice of apple, crisp and sweet. She placed on the ground near her and sat back, watching. He eyed it warily. He had been starved before. Why should he trust that this was safe? Minutes passed. Then, cautiously, he stretched his neck forward, sniffing at the fruit. His lips brushed against it, then pulled back. A hesitation. Emma didn't push. She simply smiled and whispered, It's yours if you want it. More minutes passed before he took the first bite. From that moment, everything shifted. He still wasn't fully comfortable, but something had changed. When Emma entered his stall now, his ears would twitch in recognition. He didn't back away when she cleaned his hooves. He stood still when she brushed his coat, his body no longer tense with fear. The biggest moment came when Emma, after weeks of patience, reached out to touch his muzzle. It was the first time since his rescue that he allowed human contact without flinching. "You're safe now," she murmured. It would take more time, but the walls around his heart were beginning to crumble. The past had left its scars, but every day he was learning, maybe, just maybe, not all humans were cruel. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he was loved. Trust was building, and with it, his body was growing stronger. Every day brought small victories, tiny moments that, on their own, seemed insignificant but together painted a picture of progress. He could now stand for longer periods without trembling. His appetite had increased, allowing his caretakers to slowly introduce more solid foods into his diet. His coat, once dull and lifeless, had started to regain its natural shine. But the most heartwarming change? His spirit. The donkey who had once stood motionless, staring at nothing, now showed signs of curiosity. He would perk his ears when caretakers entered his stall. His eyes, once empty, now held glimmers of awareness. And one morning, for the first time since his rescue, he took a step forward, on his own. It happened while Emma was preparing his morning feed. She had just placed a fresh bundle of hay in his stall, humming softly as she worked. Normally, he would wait for her to leave before approaching, still unsure if it was truly safe. But that day, something changed. Instead of waiting, he moved. A single step, then another, slow, deliberate, hesitant. Emma turned, surprised to see him closing the distance between them. She didn't move, didn't speak, just let the moment unfold. He stopped a few feet away, nostrils flaring as he inhaled her scent. Then, cautiously, he lowered his head and took a bite of hay. A simple act, but for him, it was monumental. From that day on, his progress accelerated. He started exploring his surroundings more, his movements gaining confidence. When Emma entered his stall, he would acknowledge her presence with a slow blink, a small yet undeniable sign of comfort. Grooming sessions, which had once been tense and uncertain, became moments of relaxation. He no longer flinched at touch. He leaned into the brush, eyes half closed, enjoying the sensation. His hooves, once cracked and painful, had been trimmed and treated, allowing him to walk more easily. Each day, he was led outside for short walks, his legs growing stronger with every step. At first, he would pause frequently, uncertain of the open space around him. But with gentle encouragement, he learned to trust the ground beneath his feet. And then came the moment that brought tears to the eyes of every caretaker at the rescue, his first attempt at a trot. It was a cool morning, the sun just beginning to rise, casting golden light over the sanctuary. Emma led him to the enclosed paddock, where the grass was soft and inviting. She unhooked his lead and stepped back, giving him space. At first, he simply stood there, ears flicking as he took in his surroundings. But then, something inside him stirred. He shifted his weight, took a step forward, then another, and then he trotted. It was slow, unsteady, but it was movement. Real, joyful movement. A freedom he hadn't known in so long. The team watched in silence, emotion thick in the air. They had saved his body, but now, finally, his spirit was beginning to heal too. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The donkey who had once been abandoned, skeletal, and on the brink of death was now unrecognizable. His coat, once patchy and dull, gleamed in the sunlight, a testament to months of proper nutrition and care. His frail, trembling legs had grown strong, carrying him across the paddock with confidence. The hollow look in his eyes had been replaced with something new, peace. And perhaps the most incredible change of all, he had learned to trust again. Emma stood by the fence, watching him graze in the open field. She still remembered the first time she had seen him, the way his body had barely clung to life, the way his spirit had seemed completely shattered. Now he was thriving. He had made it, A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and as if sensing her presence, he lifted his head. Their eyes met across the distance, and then, to her surprise, he moved toward her, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with quiet confidence. When he reached her, Emma extended her hand, palm up, offering nothing but presence. He leaned forward, pressing his soft muzzle into her touch. It was a gesture of trust, of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You found your way back." But his journey didn't end there. His transformation had made him an ambassador of hope at the sanctuary, a symbol of resilience for every animal that came after him. Visitors would hear his story, see the before and after photos, and marvel at how love and care had brought him back to life. And then, one day, the final chapter of his story arrived. A family, gentle and kind, came to the sanctuary searching for a rescue animal to adopt. They had space, time, and most importantly, love. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for a soul to welcome into their lives. When they met him, the connection was instant. He walked up to them with the same quiet confidence he had shown Emma, his journey of healing now complete. And so, after months of recovery, he left the sanctuary not as a victim, but as a survivor. As Emma watched him step into his new life, she felt no sadness, only pride, because he wasn't the same donkey who had arrived at death's door. He was free, he was loved, and he was finally home.